Good afternoon. My name is Pam McGinty. I'm a program manager for the Student Idea Board Disability Conference and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm a white cisgender woman with dark brown curly hair wearing a red shirt. My background is blue with the Michigan logo. I would like to personally welcome you to this year's conference towards an anti-ableist academy advancing inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility at UM. Throughout the month of October, this conference includes 11 online sessions between 60 or 90 minutes as part of Disability Community Month activities. The 11 sessions in total was focused on the progress made and the work still to be done on recommendations to close accessibility gaps across campus for disabled students, faculty, and staff at the University of Michigan. I was part of the Idea Board, serving on the pedagogy, career development, disability, culture, community, and climate subgroups. I was a member of various implementation groups as well. In this role, I had the opportunity to collaborate with today's speaker on some of this valuable work, which was my first introduction to disability advocacy on campus. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's session titled, I'm Not Ableist, That's Crazy, Engaging Ableism, Enabling Ableism and Disability in the Inaccessible Academy, presented by Shana Katz-Katari, Assistant Professor, School of Social Work, Department of Women and Gender Studies. Dr. Katari's research focuses on understanding how power, privilege, and oppression systemically marginalize, exclude, and discriminate against people regarding their identities / expression through negative attitudes, policies, reinforcing oppression, oppressive actions, and isolation. They are social justice advocate, cat parent, and amazing fashionista. Sarah, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Pam. This is Shanna speaking. My name is Dr. Shana Katz-Katari. I use they, them pronouns. I am a white femme with dark purple hair up in a bun, kind of cat's eye vintage style glasses, a black and white dress and tattoos, and sitting in front of a mostly white room with a canoe in the background. You might be able to guess I am at a Michigan lake house today, so joining you from afar. Let me pull up my presentation. Excellent. So yes, the talk today is I'm Not Ableist, That's Crazy, Engaging Disability and Ableism in the Inaccessible Academy. I'd like to start today out acknowledging the land that we are on as the University of Michigan. And as I quote Dr. Ramona Beltran, as we live and learn on these territories, we must keep in mind the community's struggles for self-determination and the colonial legacies of scholarly practices. I acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands stewarded by the Anishinaabe, the Three Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Wyandot Nation. I advocate for Indigenous struggles against ongoing settler colonization and strive for a decolonized future. As a side note on that, when we talk about decolonizing the academy, we talk a lot in my field about decolonizing social work, is I want to remind people that decolonization includes giving land back to those Indigenous communities. Who am I? I think it's important to center the person that is speaking or signing at the front of the room. So I am a professor of social work and also women and gender studies, as Pam so kindly mentioned. I have a PhD in social work from the University of Denver, and my work focuses on sexuality, gender, and disability. I also have a master's degree in human sexuality education from Widener University. I spent over a decade as a sexuality educator with a focus on LGBTQIA2S+, kink, non-monogamy, and disability communities. I am white, non-binary, middle class, English speaking, Jewish, neurodivergent, disabled, chronically ill, queer, fat, femme with US citizenship privilege. And it is important to note all of these as we tend to rely on our marginalized identities when we talk about privilege. And I really encourage everyone to think about what our privileged identities look like in disability and anti-ableist spaces as well. I'm a social justice advocate, a bridge builder. I really like connecting folks doing community work, doing radical work with folks in organizations like the University of Michigan and the Academy, and to help these groups connect with one another. I am an institutional boundary pusher. So for those of you who have already encountered me on campus, I am sure that has been your experience of me. And as Pam noted, I am a cat mama, although today I've got a lovely puppy with me. So if you hear dog snores, that is Marla the Pooch. All right. Oh, and just for a little bit of housekeeping, please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself during this. If you need to turn your screen on or off, if you need to move your body, if you need to eat, if you need to stim, if you need to use an ice pack and or heating pad, all of that is welcome in this space. Also, as you have questions, you are welcome to post them in the chat. I believe the chat is open to everyone. I really enjoy having ongoing dialogue as I present rather than just waiting till the end. So feel free to use emoji reactions, feel free to ask questions, feel free to say things. So feel free to use the chat. You can also use the Q&A function. And one of our fantastic producers will let me know what the Q&A questions are. And then there'll be time at the end for a little bit of discussion and time for more questions, and hopefully answers if I have them. All right. I am operating with the assumption that not everybody has been able to go to every single conference. And so or every single panel or presentation that's part of this conference. So I like to give a little bit of background on language before I delve in. So when we talk about people with disabilities or disabled people, recent data shows that approximately 26% of adults in the United States reporting having had one or more disabilities. And that is inclusive of all of these different things. And we also know it is an underreport. And reasons that people might not report having a disability or an illness or impairment are several. The first is stigma. There's a lot of stigma about being disabled, as I'm sure many of you know. And so some people with disabilities don't want to name that for themselves or to name that to another outside entity. Additionally, there's that internalized stigma of people not being sure if they count, which I've put in quotation marks, as being disabled, or if they're really a person with disabilities, especially if someone is not on SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, or labeled as disabled through an institution, they might not feel like they can say they have a disability. There's also the complicated thing of what do we mean by disabilities? And oftentimes folks who have mental health concerns or mental illness, folks who have chronic illness and chronic pain, are not sure whether or not they should be allowed to say that they are a person with disabilities. So more than a quarter of the population, I would argue likely more, and that doesn't even take into account short-term disabilities like I'm from Colorado growing up, and so you can imagine during the winter you see a lot more people on crutches due to ACL and MCL injuries from skiing. Additionally, in our society, being pregnant is considered a short-term disability. And so these are often not answered in these larger surveys and census. And it can make it really challenging. Renee in the chat says, I do find that disability community tends to be very inclusive about who is the part of the community and set of identities, but often the concern about not counting in quotation marks comes often in concern that non-disabled people assume that someone doesn't count. And that's a great observation, and that's some of the ableism that we experience. You also might notice that I am going back and forth between person first language, which are things like people with disabilities, a woman in a wheelchair, a man who is blind, or a non-binary person with autism, and identity first language, which are things like disabled people, a wheelchair using woman, a blind man, and an autistic non-binary person. And so for a long time, there were, and continue to be so, really horrible words used about people with disabilities. And so in the 90s, there's a lot of amazing activism that resulted in the ADA. If you haven't seen the documentary Crip Camp, it's on Netflix and I highly recommend it. And so disability rights movement said, let's move to person first language. Let's be like, we are people first and our disability is not what defines us. And that really works well for some people. For others of us though, myself included, I find that identity first language fits better for a couple of reasons. First of all, it fits in with all of the other identity language that we use. We don't say a man with gay tendencies. If you do say that, please stop. We don't say a woman of Latina heritage. We say a Latina woman. We don't say a tall person with tallness, right? It's even hard to think about it. We say a tall person. So what is so different about disability that it's so bad that we have to separate it out, right? I just like to include it along with all of my other pieces of who I am. Then there's also the idea, the social model of disability, which is coming next. And that is the idea that society is what disables us, right? So that if every curb, every sidewalk had a curb cut and was in good condition, every building had elevators or ramps that worked on a regular basis, every book and article was made screen reader capable, we had flexible work environments, right, where we didn't all have to show up at 8 a.m., we wouldn't have our differences, our natural diversity wouldn't be a disability, right? It would just be who we are. And so it is society's choices that disable us. There's also an image on the screen. It's an image of 9 smaller squares, blue squares in a 3x4 grid. And the squares represent different things such as neurodiversity, blindness, signing, which represents deaf culture. There's also a pregnant person on here, as I noted for that. In the chat, Patricia has pointed out that in Michigan, statistics are that 29% of adults report having a disability, but at the University of Michigan, only 4% of faculty and 6% of staff report having a disability. So that is a very underrepresentation of the population here in Michigan. Additionally, I would say that in my personal knowledge, those numbers are those numbers are higher, but our campus is not, and historically has not been a safe place for people to come out around their disability and name that. Winter shares that they are very upset about that. And Josh points out, to Patricia's point, that the number of students registered with the Office of Students with Disabilities, Services for Students with Disabilities, is markedly lower than that which we would expect based on comparisons with peer institutions of similar sizes and what we know about disability and how it's distributed through the population. We have to ask ourselves whether this means there are simply fewer disabled people here than we'd expect, or whether systematic barriers prevent or discourage reporting disability or registering with SSD, or both. So really great points. Thank you. Now, as someone pointed out, and Renee, I think, pointed out in the chat earlier, right? Disability community is inclusive of so many different types of disabilities. So acquired versus congenital, right? Congenital is something you have at birth. Acquired is something that happens later in life. It could even be as a child, but not at birth. Apparent versus non-apparent disabilities and impairments. So if someone was to look at me sitting right now, I don't, quote, look disabled. And even if I'm out and about, unless you see my cane, you probably would not assume I am. And so that both comes with privilege in some ways, in that I don't experience explicit ableism as often, and also more challenges in that I often get, I've been screamed at in parking lots because of my accessible parking space choice and in other settings. And sometimes I don't feel as included in the community because people don't assume I'm part of it. Short-term versus long-term, we mentioned. Some people like to put them in very clear categories, you know, physical, learning disabilities, intellectual and developmental, socio-emotional. neurodivergence and neurodiversity are newer topics to the conversation. Neurodiversity is this overarching umbrella of the fact that brains all work super differently. And neurodivergence is people that diverge from what we consider typical in brains. So neurotypical people are those who are not neurodivergent. I am autistic, I am neurodivergent. I also remind folks that a lot of these things are concurrent with one another. And so just because someone is depressed doesn't mean that they are not also blind, right? And we don't get to just choose one. And also there's been a lot of conversation around how chronic pain and chronic illness fits into this picture. And a lot of that, I think, comes from a very misogynistic background, given that many people who experience chronic illness and chronic pain are assigned female at birth and women in the world. And so what I love about disability community is that it is constantly expanding to say, you're included, you get to be part of this, let's do this work together. There's also the challenges of how society views an impairment or illness. For example, different types of cancer. So if someone has breast cancer, right, in our society, there's pink things everywhere. We can talk about Susan Komen in another talk, right? But there's a lot of empathy, a lot of sympathy. If somebody has lung cancer, there might be questions of, oh, did you smoke? For how long? When did you stop? And we tend to want to put blame on people. Similarly with TBI, which is traumatic brain injury. If someone got it when they were in the military, we might have different responses than if someone got it from a car accident, in which case we again try to place blame. Oh, were you driving? Were you texting? Were you drinking? In the chat, Jessica has said that Health Services reports 22% of students were living with disabilities in 2018, but only 2,708 were registered with the services for students with disability as of 2017, and has put some links in the chat. Laura says, thank you for naming chronic pain as a disability. I suffer with this after an accident, catastrophic accident, but it's not apparent to folks and people don't understand how it impacts the way I walk through the world. Patricia says the U of M climate survey will be gathering data again this winter or fall. This will include gathering data around people with disabilities on campus. This data helps to inform resource allocation around these issues. I already have spoken to this a little bit, but there's an image on the screen that represents the social model of disability. There's a person in a circle, and the circle represents society, and there are all of these barriers around the person. And next to the circle is the idea of social barriers, and that includes things like the environment and having inaccessible environments, buildings that are inaccessible. I often give the example of historic buildings, which often don't need to be made accessible in our culture. Services that are inaccessible, language. So this is the privileging of speaking over signing or typing. And the idea that to be a good communicator, you have to speak out loud. And I will call myself in at the moment, as I just got 2 notes from the admin asking me to slow down when I speak, which is amusing to me because I already feel I'm at about 20% of how fast I usually speak. And so a reminder that our different ways that we communicate land differently in different spaces. As a Jewish autistic person, conversational overlap and a lot of talking really quickly is what feels comfortable to me, and to be in a space where other people who need ASL or captioning means I need to slow myself down a bit so that everybody can access what I'm saying. Another set of barriers are attitudes in our society. So prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination against people with disabilities. And organizations, and this is really where we're going to focus today, that have inflexible policies and practices. But even outside of the academy, I gave the example of the 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 workday, and the idea that to be a, quote, productive member of our society, you have to work 40 hours a week in these very specific timeframes doesn't meet with a lot of needs of people. And so if we could be more flexible, things would be more accessible. Similarly, pre-pandemic, disabled people have been asking for more flexible work from home policies for a very long time. And we were constantly told it's not possible. It won't be as effective. You won't be able to do your work. This is just something we cannot do. And then we hit March of 2020, and seemingly overnight, everything went online, from staff work to the classes. I've taught online classes only for the past year and a half. And so it was doable. It was just a choice that our organizations made not to let that happen. There is a grumbly dog in the background. Please bear with me. I don't always use lists of say this and not that, because it's important to note that language changes a lot over time and is constantly shifting. And what I also will say is that every individual has language that best fits their needs. And so if somebody uses one of these terms, you are absolutely welcome to mirror back to them the language that they use. And in general, these are not terms that are embraced by disability community at this point. So the word handicapped is not accurate, and that includes parking spaces. They are accessible spaces, spaces that make things accessible to certain types of disabilities and impairments, but they are not handicap spaces. The term special needs, this comes up, I think, a lot with young people and children. But the reality is we all have special needs, right? We all needed to be able to figure out different ways of showing up in today's space, or maybe you're watching this as a recording later on. Some of us need to work early morning. Some of us need to work late at night. Some of us need captions. Some of us need an ASL interpreter. Some of us need to eat every hour. Some of us eat 1 or 2 big meals a day. And it doesn't mean that anything is different. We all have special needs in how we show up in the world. And when we use the language of special needs, it makes it seem like accommodations are a special bonus, when in reality, they are basic human rights. We don't use the term wheelchair bound or bed bound unless, and this is my sex educator talking, somebody is bondage to a wheelchair or bed, then that language is fine. We don't use bedridden anymore. Crippled, although the term crip is being reclaimed in a lot of spaces. Invalid is not used, and I'm always interested from a etymology standpoint of where invalid is also the same as invalid spelling wise. The term suffers from, this is something that we should not be placing on other people. If someone uses that language themselves, that's fine, but I don't suffer from my anxiety. I navigate it and am challenged by it, but it's not something that I suffer from. Then there are these words, I am going to read them out loud for best practice for accessibility, but we really encourage people not to use this language anymore. And it is something that I will name. It took me 2 years to get crazy out of my vocabulary. I had to have all of my friends make air horn noises at me whenever I said the word crazy. But this is all language that is ableist and comes from the idea that we're that people with disabilities are less than. So the words are crazy, insane, lame, spaz, which comes from being spastic, paralyzed, which I see a lot in social justice spaces for the idea that people don't know what to do. So I encourage folks to use the term frozen, dumb, idiot, mute, imbecile, maniac, moron. I saw a meme the other day that pointed out that the author of the meme was trying to figure out a way to insult people that wasn't ableist, and they didn't have any language to use. And that's pretty deep to say that almost all of the language we use as insults refers to disability. And what does that mean? I'm going to check in on the chat over here. A couple of people have asked questions about the survey for Patricia, wanting to know if it'll be a random sample or everyone. Patricia wishes she knew. She doesn't have a lot of information. The last one was in 2017. This is the 5-year update. Someone asked a great question. Laura said, any language folks find that young children respond to well, then special needs. I know my child with sensory needs has embraced special needs as a way to advocate for her needs. And what I would say is really empowering kids to say, this is what I need to be my best self in this space, or this is what I need to be able to participate in this space. And in the same way that we should support young people and children in owning their power in whoever they are, whether that is Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, whether that is queer and trans children, whether this is children with sensory needs. Even the language of sensory needs is fine. It's the idea that these needs are special or different that's the biggest challenge. Leah responded to Todd saying she believed, or that they believe that everyone will take the survey with a randomized subset taking a longer version. It should be coming out at the end of the month. Patricia points out to Laura that's true in their family as well. So the phrase comes and goes. Renee points out that ableism is really baked into our language. We often use disability terms as metaphors and insults. Pam wanted to know why paralyzed is inappropriate. Is it not a medical term? It is completely appropriate as a medical term, but what happens is that people will use the language to say, oh, I don't know how to engage in the Black Lives Matter movement. I feel so paralyzed. When what they mean is frozen or scared or unsure of how to help. So it's things like spastic are also okay to be used in a medical sense, right? Sometimes my muscles are spastic, but it shouldn't be used for other people. Chantel says that they are glad the R word is so dated. It didn't come up in this presentation. That's a really good thing. Laura says that best self language is helpful. Yes, Todd was appreciative of Leah's feedback. Renee, slowing down. Renee points out that also ableist is when non-disabled people use disabilities as adjectives about their own traits, when they don't have that disability or chronic illness. For example, I'm so OCD about that. I'm being so bipolar. And also that gave me PTSD when it wasn't traumatizing. That's a really great point. And Renee dropped a video link in the chat. I love how engaged you all are. Hannah said, can you give examples of words we can use instead of crazy? I love that. I've been trying to remove it from my vocabulary as well and have been having a hard time to find non-ableist language to use. So what I remind folks is that if you're familiar with The Giver by Lois Lowry, there's a point where they talk about the importance of precision of language. And that is what I encourage people, because when we use the term crazy, we use it to mean so many different things. So if it's something that's really out there, I might say that's really out there, that's wild, that's ludicrous, that's ridiculous. If it's something I don't like a test that I took, instead of saying that test was so crazy, I might say that test was really hard, that test was frustrating, that test got my hackles up, that test was all over the place, right? But being more specific about things that are said. I'm trying to, Josh points out the R word still comes up in U of M materials. There's a Q&A question about, can you suggest in golf or bowling alternatives to handicap? That is a great question. I have never been asked that. So mazel tov on figuring out something I've never been asked. I'm not a sportsy person. The only sports I have done are ice skating, hockey, and roller derby, which don't have that. So I don't actually know how handicap is used in those terms. So I will circle back around to that at some point. Rachel wants to know if anyone has a good replacement for lame. They've really struggled to replace that in their vocabulary. Someone suggested intense, which might be for crazy. I'm not sure. But again, precision of language. Is something lame because it's boring? Is that what we mean to say, which is often how it comes up, or not our best work, or annoying, right? So just being very specific. All right, I'm trying to catch up on the chat. Absurd and ridiculous are a couple. Going with, so bonkers and bananas are actually synonyms for crazy. So I would encourage us to stay away from those, but wild and outrageous, chaotic is great. Yeah, Hannah brought up a good point that if wild could be problematic, since sometimes non-white populations are depicted as wild, and that is absolutely something that has come up. So yeah, again, thinking about, you know, the work we do has to be intentional, and it feels like extra labor to folks. And for me, a reframe of it's not about being PC, it's about being respectful, has made all of that labor always worth it. Erica said maybe in sports it could be a disadvantage. Mary Beth wanted me to talk about the standard interview format and how it's ableist. Yes, that's coming. Someone suggested uncool as a synonym for lame, dorky, boring, goofy, blasé, hokey, frustrating or annoying, did not meet expectations. Starting level instead of handicapped is great. All right, I think we've answered those. Okay, I'm going to keep moving on because I want to make sure we get through all this content today. So ableism is the acts of prejudice or discrimination against people with disabilities and the devaluation of disability. So in general, this is things like we value walking more than rolling. We value eye contact and spoken direct, in quotation marks, communication more than typed or signed or words when we're not looking at someone, despite that being both ableist and I would also argue xenophobic, as there are many cultures that don't make such direct eye contact and use as direct of communication. In academic settings, this can look like us versus them narratives. I see this a lot in the quote helping professions like social work. So students, faculty, and staff are non-disabled. The people we serve are not, they are disabled. So when we speak as social workers, like you may encounter disabled people in your practice, which indicates that there are not disabled people already in the classroom. The way that we require students to jump through multiple hoops in order to get basic needed accommodations, and worse yet, not providing them even when they have a visa letter from Services for Students with Disabilities. This is what Mary Beth brought up, is having very strenuous job interview visits. I will say my campus visit here was 2 days long, from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. the first day, and 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. the second day. I often did not have time to go to the bathroom between things. Having to build an extra time to go to the elevator instead of taking the stairs made me late for some of my meetings. I couldn't do a campus tour because I couldn't walk around campus, and there had not been an adaptability to perhaps give me a campus tour in a golf cart or some sort of other option. Those type of things, or having somebody throw all of these questions at someone and then expect them to remember everything and answer them can be really challenging. Events being designed exclusively around mobility, sight, or sound. So sometimes this shows up in exhibits on campus where you have to walk around something or physically touch things in order to engage it. Sometimes it's a event that's only about something you can see, which is not accessible for blind folks, or something you can only hear. Having accessible entrances in the back of buildings are hard to find, and accessible parking on campus is one of the biggest challenges. I was actually late for a talk on ableism for the School of Education, because even with my blue pass, I spent 50 minutes driving around to look for a spot, and finally just parked in a waiting spot and put on my blinkers with the hope I wouldn't get towed by the time my talk was done. Not having accessible stages or fronts of classrooms to teach in. There was a LGBTQ research symposium in Rackham a couple of years ago, and to get to the front of the stage where you presented, you had to go down a flight of stairs. And this often happens in academic spaces where there'll be an accessible spot or two for people at the back of the auditorium, but there's no accessible way for people to get on the stage or the front of the classroom, which indicates that we don't expect faculty to be disabled. Similarly, when there's only one spot for a wheelchair, that's the assumption that there's only going to be one wheelchair user in a class, which is a pretty big assumption. Inflexible work from home policies. I talked about that a little bit, or as recently came up and has come up with some motions that were recently passed by the Faculty Senate. Having work connections contradict Michigan Medicine or University of Michigan physicians and send people to work in person who are immune compromised or who are recovering from COVID and having their cases denied. Also not supporting staff and faculty with accessing accommodations. We are not as great about sending, students to services with students and disabilities as we could be. And faculty get a lot of training on where they should send people and how they should do that. There's very little information for staff and faculty on how to get accommodations, what the process is, or as something that has happened to more than one person on this campus is having them get the request for accommodations, and because it takes so long to put the accommodations in place, writing them up for issues they had between having the accommodation request and getting them the accommodations. And when a staff member is written up, it means they cannot get a raise, even if it was because they were unable to do the work because their accommodations had not been met. Chantel in the chat says, in response to Josh saying the R word is sometimes used, that makes Chantel really sad. I know this was a slang word used years ago, similar to how people use crazy, and it absolutely should not be used in any circumstance. This is about the R word. It is extremely disrespectful to any person, and I can't imagine seeing it in the workplace. I hope people feel empowered to speak out regarding that language so it can be taken out of materials. Patricia posted an article with UHS, so the University Health Services data, very small sample, who points out that 50% of our students who had COVID ended up with long COVID. And Kristen says, what's frustrating and what I see a lot is that the university falls back on meeting ADA compliance, which ignores any sort of inclusion. And that, Kristen, I really appreciate, because I think some of the difference between people with disabilities and disabled people can sometimes be summed up into conditions versus identity. And while as someone with medical conditions that need treatment, I recognize that those conditions need treatment and need support. And so sometimes those diagnoses are important. And for me, as an autistic, chronically ill, disabled person, my disability community is one of the best communities in my life and makes me feel so connected. And so seeing disability as also an identity and a culture is really important. And I would really encourage everyone who is here to advocate for the university to have a disability cultural center. And I'm hoping one of the DC at UM folks in the chat could put the information about our listserv in there, as there is a group of folks organizing for such a disability cultural center. Microaggressions are everyday interactions that perpetuate inequalities and stereotypes against those in marginalized communities. It sounds like there are issues with the sound. I'm going to ask if somebody can let me know if they can still hear me. Okay, Mala says yes. Okay, thank you all. It sounds like this might be a challenge for Dana, if someone can reach out to them and help. So microaggressions are not small, but they tend to be more implicit. And what we know about microaggressions, because I did my dissertation on this, is the more microaggressions you experience, the poorer your mental health outcomes. So higher levels of depression, higher levels of anxiety, and lower levels of behavioral control. So we know that ableist microaggressions are very harmful. They can be often unintentional or unrealized. I always tell my students that none of us mean to show up as jerks, right? I do microaggression work all the time, and I still microaggress people, right? So these are things that happen. They can be verbal or nonverbal, and we just really need to work on acknowledging when they happen, apologizing, moving on, and doing better. So some examples that show up in the academy are requiring cameras to be turned on while on Zoom. That is also classist, with the assumption that we all have spaces that are what we want to show the world behind us. Laptop bans in in-person teaching. Often instructors will do this. And then what happens is the only people who get to use laptops are the ones who have accommodations that allow them to do that. And so you are outing all of those students into that setting. Not turning on captions, describing images, using old copies, photocopies of books. So in case you're not aware, on Zoom has captions, auto captions. They are not perfect. And we are lucky to have an official captioner today. But at the very, very, very least, you should be turning on captions every time you host a Zoom meeting, period. You should describe the images you see on the screen and or use alt text and image descriptions when you put them into a PowerPoint and send them out. When we use old photocopies of books, not only are they impossible for our students with screen readers to use, it's just hard for a lot of folks to have to like zoom in really close, they get fuzzy, etc. Language like "that's so crazy," as you can all see, assuming that everyone can see, that feels really tone deaf to me. Not including disabled scholars on syllabi. And oftentimes when we talk about disability, particularly neurodivergence, having non-disabled and neurotypical scholars on the syllabi that wrote about this, but are not part of the community. Not labeling food with allergens at meetings and events. It should say whether it includes wheat, dairy, eggs, etc. Not using microphones in bigger meetings. Oftentimes people will say, "Can you hear me?" Or "I'm really loud, I don't need a microphone." But for folks who are online or who use cochlear implants or amplifiers, being able to hear with a microphone is crucial. 8 or 9 a.m. committee meetings. I will say, as a person with chronic fatigue, that is a no-go for many folks. And requiring in-person or having only in-person options, especially now, through the pandemic, we have seen that that is not something that has to happen. Carrie says, "I have also seen instances where someone with a disability is asked to do work that is especially difficult or not possible for them, and that is not an essential duty of their job. And when they ask for an accommodation or ask for that work to be redistributed to someone else, they were ignored, judged, or penalized." That's a really great point. And something I encourage when I talk with nonprofits and for-profit companies is when you do a job posting, for example, very few people actually have to carry 30 pounds and bend down for their day-to-day jobs. You do not need to include that as a requirement. And if, for example, it is an occasional requirement of the job, it doesn't need to be required of that person, as Carrie pointed out. It could be someone else that does those things. And so instead of trying to force, what is the phrase, a square peg into a round hole, saying, wow, this is amazing round peg, let's find someone else who can pick up these 30-pound boxes that may or may not exist. Renee says, I would love to learn a variety of ways to add captions to Zoom outside of UMich auto captions. How do we do this in our personal Zoom accounts? So first of all, most people's personal Zoom accounts should have captions at this point. I believe not all business and university accounts have that. So what I would encourage is advocacy to Zoom, right? We know Zoom has the capacity to have those captions. There's no reason it should not be rolled out completely across all Zoom platforms. Advocacy there is important. Working with organizations to purchase that option. And then I also know that there are a variety of ways that people can connect with outside like apps and websites. I am not as familiar off the top of my head. So if anyone has that knowledge and can put it in the chat, I would appreciate it. Patricia says, a great example of how the job requirements are designed to exclude people with disabilities. Yes. And Natasha says, the problem with hammering a square peg into a round hole is not that the hammering is hard, it is that it destroys the peg. That is a really beautiful thing. Mary Beth also liked that. Melissa points out that captions in other languages outside of English can be very difficult to manage. Todd points out to Renee that if you don't see the option to add auto captions to meetings on your personal Zoom, there are third-party apps you can purchase to provide captions. Renee works for the Epilepsy Foundation of Michigan, and sometimes in job descriptions, companies mention they require a driver's license when people never need to drive for their job. It's a way of weeding out people with certain disabilities from applying. And Patricia has put in some free links to free web captioning, and Pam notes that Zoom has the capacity to assign a third party like a cart provider. I'm going to keep moving because I have 9 minutes left. I love how engaged everybody is. Okay, so here is some basic low-hanging fruit. I didn't want to tell you all of these crappy things and then leave you with nothing to do. So first of all, always turn on captions on Zoom, on movies you watch, on YouTube, right? We are up at this lake house and so had to switch to a new TV setting. And it boggles my mind that we don't make captions automatic and that you have to turn them off rather than going through the process of turning them on, because so many people of differing abilities benefit from captions. I'm not deaf, but my neurodivergence means captions help me to focus and keep on track. When you have events, putting something at the bottom on your RSVP that just says access needs, where people can share anything from food allergies to needing an ASL interpreter, to needing a comfortable space to sit, to arriving late. Any of those things are great, and you wouldn't know about them unless you have that. The School of Social Work has had that since I arrived here in 2017, and I'm constantly surprised when I RSVP elsewhere on campus and they don't have that. Work to incorporate universal design for learning. This is an idea of how do we make classrooms and institutions, educational institutions, as accessible as possible from the beginning. So while some people may still need accommodations, things like not having attendance policies, things like flexible grading and extensions, things like no laptop bans, multiple ways to do assignments. So maybe a typed self-reflection or a videoed self-reflection. These are parts of UDL, and CRLT, our Center for Research on Learning and Teaching, it has a great UDL training you can do. Let folks know that they can use their camera or not, they can fidget or not, move their bodies as needed, eat as needed, take breaks as needed, not just on Zoom, but in the classrooms. Create a disability and accommodations consulting group for faculty and staff in your unit. One person should not have to take all of this on. And so having people connect, and when there's spots that we're missing, there's gaps, someone else can help fill it in or even notice it. Don't make mandatory meetings before 10 a.m. Have virtual options even when we go back in person, something I love about this talk today. Familiarize yourself with services for students with disabilities, CART, local ASL interpreters, etc. And Gina just posted in the chat a spreadsheet of ASL interpreters, CART contacts, and websites. So that sheet is from the National Center for Institutional Diversity. So thank you for sharing that. Know what areas of your school or unit are accessible and work on those that need improvement. It doesn't have to be big things. When I first joined the School of Social Work, our elevator broke down. And but I didn't know this. So I was like standing waiting for the elevator for like 20 minutes. And finally somebody was like, oh, the elevator's broken. And I sent a letter to facilities saying, could you put a sign up so that I know not to stand here, and I have other disabled people coming to visit me so that they don't have to worry about that. And the reply at the time wasn't particularly helpful, but what eventually went up was a sign next to the elevator that says, if this elevator is down, please go to the left and through these doors to find the freight elevator so you can still get to where you're going. Which was great, but then there was all of these chemical barrels there. So I pointed that out and facilities removed them. It doesn't have to be a big deal. Just having those conversations can be helpful. Checking your vocabulary and have your colleagues support you in this. We talked about this a little bit already, right? But being able to check each other and call each other in is really helpful. Adding alt text and image descriptions to your websites and PowerPoints. Purchasing furniture that works for multiple types of bodies. Please stop purchasing combination desk chair combos. They do not work for any body. They are not good for fat people. They are not good for pregnant people. They are not good for tall people. They are not good for left-handed people, and they are not good for disabled people. Using accessible fonts like Arial, as compared to Times New Roman, which is harder to read for a lot of folks. And modeling an access need check-in at the beginning of meetings, events, etc. Our event today was a little large to do that, but what I usually do every day at the beginning of class is I ask folks to share their names, their pronouns if they're willing. I do a fun check-in question, and then I say, what are your access needs? And we all have access needs, right? We talked about that with special needs. And if they're all met, you can just say, my access needs are met. But it might be something like, I'm having a rough go today and I'm laying on my ice pack, so I might be flat in bed, and I just need to let you all know that. Or I had a student the other day who said, my meds aren't working and my face is making some, spasm related expressions. So I'm not responding to any of you. That's just what I'm doing today, right? And so it's not a space to apologize for your disability or your needs. It is a space for everybody to show up fully as themselves. It's also a great space for, I have students who are parents and are like, oh, you may see little ones running around today, or I have to leave class early to go pick up my kids. Everybody has access needs. So I'm going to go through all the questions I have. Don't worry, I'm coming back. But things to think about, because I wanted to make sure that these are on your radar before my time is officially up in 2 minutes. So thinking about where else do you think ableism is perpetuated in the academy? And you all have been great about putting that in the chat. What are some beliefs or attitudes that you, even as some of you are disabled people, what are some of those beliefs and attitudes you hold that might reinforce ableism? And how might you challenge these attitudes and beliefs in yourself and others as you move forward? So let me make sure I get through all these questions. I'm getting interesting things popping up here. Somebody wanted to know about a link to the UDL training, and off the top of my head, I don't know where it is because it was just given to us as a canvas in the School of Social Work. Dr. Stephanie Rosen, who is a librarian and the accessibility specialist, created it. So I would reach out to CRLT and or Dr. Rosen. People have provided Renee some things about captions and how to get them. Patricia notes that auditory processing challenges with captions are super helpful. Mary Beth wants to know, how do we create a culture of anti-ableism in Michigan HR to create a new culture and set practices for interviews? Otherwise, individual candidates have to be self-advocates, which can be disadvantageous. That's a great question, Mary Beth. One of the biggest challenges is that I remind folks that HR is on the side of the institution and not on the side of individuals. And so this may be more of a grassroots bottom-up approach where individual units agree to hand out questions to people in advance, or at least the sheet at the beginning where they can sit and look at them, and people can advocate for their unit to change how they do those things, while at the same time encouraging anti-ableism at the entire institution, which will hopefully trickle down into HR. But I think that might be more of a grassroots approach. I'm seeing an anonymous question. How do we create a, oh yes, that question already came up. Hospital yesterday only had one elevator working in a bank of 3. That happens often. People have said thank you. Dilip has indicated, and I should definitely remind you all at the end of this, I just wanted to share, my slides were shared, and so you should be able to see these, but here are some reading suggestions if you are interested in more pieces on this. And then if you'd like to contact me, if I can be of any support or help, there's my contact info. Next Wednesday at 9 a.m. It's a 1-hour training called Dismantling Ableism Across Academic Spaces and Hierarchies. And it's really designed for deans and chairs. So please encourage your dean and chair to do this, and your supervisors. Otherwise, thank you so much for this. I'm really glad that many of your questions were addressed and your concerns. I hope everybody can commit to being an advocate in this space. Yes, so thank you all so much. You all are very kind. I hope that you continue to go to many more of these amazing presentations. This type of conference is unprecedented, particularly at UM. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Please take care of yourselves, stay safe. Many thanks to our CART captioner, Kate, and to our 2 interpreters, Yakata and Mala, and to Pam and Dilip for putting this together, and for our wonderful production team. So thank you. Please take care.